soldiers. They're supposed to be seen as tough, strong, and able to endure all types of situations and traumatic experiences. Many vets, however, returned home to America as changed people. Incidences of mental health were prevalent, specifically PTSD, and oftentimes they were just seen as signs of weakness or simply as aftershocks of the war rather than as actual conditions that the soldiers carried with them. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association recognized PTSD as an actual condition, and it was placed in the association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Since then, we've been able to make a few steps in helping Vietnam veterans and those who've suffered from PTSD. Our project will unveil statistics of Vietnam veterans in the past and present, current policy, and then look at the application of masculinity concepts for survivors of war and sexual abuse. Enjoy!
There are two main studies on veterans from the Vietnam War. Both studies were completed by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. The first was a comprehensive study on how vets were readjusting to life after the war. Not surprisingly, the study is called the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study. It was completed in 1983 and wanted to find the prevalence of psychological disorders, not just PTSD, but also depression and other factors like job instability, marriage, conflict, and the like. Major findings were both surprising and oddly intuitive, starting with the relatively obvious. Vets who saw more of high combat zones had an increased rate of both PTSD and physical health issues. This constituted 38.5% of high combat zone veterans. A more surprising finding, perhaps, was the results from African American and Latino veterans reporting more mental health and life adjustment issues, possibly due to pre-war trauma and possible post-war discrimination. Unfortunately, findings showed that only a small number of veterans sought treatment for both mental and social issues. The most recent study on Vietnam War veterans was completed and released just last year. This was an updated survey to find out the lasting effects of the war as many vets transitioned to retirement. It had 2,000 of the original participants from the 1983 readjustment study. The good news is that 70 to 75% of Vietnam vets studied never suffered from mental illness related to war. Mental illness could include PTSD, depression, drug addiction, or alcoholism. However, 11% of vets are in, quote, serious trouble, which includes mental illness, but also social alienation from family and friends. They experience regular flashbacks and sleep disorders. Arguably, there are more than just 270,000 Vietnam vets suffering from the war in some way. Without responses from the Vietnam vets who are truly struggling with disorders like PTSD, schizophrenia, and manic depressive disorder, it's truly difficult to understand the breadth of impact the Vietnam War still has on our country today. Take a brief look at the next slide for an easy-to-read table on the risk factors for developing PTSD, but also the constant factors that might be present to prevent someone from overcoming the disorder.
Soldiers must face a number of dangers in combat, but perhaps the most significant danger that many face is the threat of post-traumatic stress disorder when they return home. During the Great Wars of the early 20th century, terms such as shell shock, battle fatigue, and malingering were used to describe the mental effects that soldiers exhibited. It was not until the years following the Vietnam War where medical professionals and policymakers began looking at the serious effects of combat on soldiers readjusting to society. However, it was not until 1983 that the first study was done to look at the traumatic disorders affecting Vietnam veterans. Like many unknown disorders that began to be studied, it would take another 20 years before enough data and knowledge could be employed to effectively treat military personnel with PTSD. One of the greatest challenges in treating PTSD is that many veterans do not report PTSD or seek help when they return from combat zones. Members of the military are trained to be tough, to compartmentalize, to disassociate from emotion, all in order to get the job done, to accomplish the mission and return home alive. The mental terrors experienced by veterans once they return can make veterans, especially men, feel less masculine as a result and choose to deal with these issues on their own. Unfortunately, substance abuse, sexual violence, and self-destructive behavior can follow due to self-medicating. As a result, in 2015, there were more military suicides than combat deaths in Afghanistan. The medical community is making progress, however, with statistical data that supports their research as well as rehabilitation efforts to help treat wounded veterans. What is also needed is greater policy initiatives to put in place government-funded structures to maximize help. A report from the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies was released in 2014 that studied the legislative response to PTSD in the United States between the years 1989 and 2009. The study particularly focused on federal legislation as the most impactful means of implementing policy due to the mandate such policies carry and the immense resources that Congress has at its disposal. Between 1989 and 2009, there were 161 bills introduced in the U.S. Congress that specifically dealt with PTSD. Some of the bills include the Persian Gulf Conflict Supplemental Authorization and Personnel Benefits Act of 1991, the Veterans PTSD Treatment and Psychological Readjustment Act of 1993, and the Comprehensive Assistance for Veterans Exposed to Traumatic Stressors Act of 2004. The only area of studying PTSD where U.S. policy has fallen short is that of addressing PTSD in civilians. Of all the legislation proposed regarding PTSD treatment, 91.4% of the legislation proposed dealt specifically with military personnel. 5.5% targeted civilians and military personnel, while only 3.1% of the proposed legislation targeted only civilians. While it is clear that over the last 2 to 3 decades, PTSD has become more of an acknowledged and recognized mental illness that requires immediate attention, veterans are seeking help at greater numbers because the stigma associated with PTSD has dramatically decreased. There has been a greater effort from a policy standpoint to implement federally mandated help for veterans, more so than ever existed in the years before Vietnam or in the years following Vietnam. The next step is to ensure that all people, military and civilians, have access to the same health care to fight PTSD, which can occur not just in combat zones.
War zone combat is the most widely known cause of PTSD in American society. When people think of those who have combat PTSD, they typically think of men who struggle silently, with occasional violent outbursts which those around them are expected to accept and understand. The other most commonly known cause of PTSD is sexual violence, but when people think of those survivors, they tend to think of women. This led me to pose the research question, how does society view the masculinity of male war combat veterans with PTSD differently than how we view the masculinity of male survivors of abuse with PTSD? Chamberlain's examination of the social history of PTSD of combat veterans traces the history of the condition from shell shock to PTSD. Chamberlain writes that the condition was highly stigmatized in the early 20th century, and men who suffered wartime trauma were seen as lesser than the men who did not. However, over the course of the wars in which America was involved in the 20th century, it became apparent to American society that significant numbers of men faced trauma from the stress of combat. Chamberlain writes that the narrative surrounding PTSD then provided an honorable explanation for men breaking down under stress. By medicalizing this unmanly behavior, doctors avoided being forced to diagnose personal failure, and military authorities avoided explaining the emasculating behavior or cowardice of previously brave soldiers. In keeping with this view of men with combat PTSD as troubled heroes, McLean and Claycamp studied attitudes toward male veterans who served in Iraq. McLean and Claycamp found that while people do tend to hold negative stereotypical views of these men, believing they're likely to have psychological problems, those negative stereotypes do not translate into discrimination because these veterans hold significant symbolic capital in American society. This means, although American society tends to view combat veterans as more likely to exhibit behavior that would typically emasculate men, they are not emasculated because combat veterans are considered to be hegemonically and dominantly masculine by virtue of their service to their country. Caddick, Smith, and Phoenix studied combat vets with PTSD who took part in a charity that provided outdoor activities as treatment. These researchers found that the veterans were able to perform hegemonic masculinity by reconstructing their trauma experiences into masculine behaviors, such as reframing seeking help as an assertive, proactive, masculine thing to do. Veterans are able to do this in society because of the respect that they are accorded. In contrast to the societal view of combat veterans with PTSD, male sexual abuse survivors are accorded a position of subordinate masculinity from which they are often unable to recover once they have opened up about their sexual violence experiences. Studies such as this first one I've cited from the Scandinavian Journal of Public Health find that adult men who have experienced sexual abuse report different effects and different responses than women who have experienced sexual abuse. One notable finding is that men report that they externalize their anger through violence, whereas women internalize their anger that results from sexual abuse. Chan finds that male sexual abuse survivors with PTSD face difficulties in recovery due to the limitations placed on them by societal masculine norms. Most of the treatments and programs for PTSD from sexual violence have focused on the needs of female survivors, but Chan and other researchers call attention to the need of mental health professionals to address the needs of male survivors in the context of masculinity.
Tim O'Brien captured the experiences of Vietnam War veterans and the things they carried. They carried all the emotional baggage of men who might die. Grief, terror, love, longing, these were intangibles, but the tangibles had their own mass and specific gravity. They had tangible weight. They carried shameful memories. They carried the common secret of cowardice barely restrained, the instinct to run or freeze or hide, and in many respects this was the heaviest burden of all, for it could never be put down. It required perfect balance and perfect posture. The addition of PTSD and the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980 finally legitimized PTSD as a mental health condition rather than an aftershock or simple weakness of the war. Conversations continue as a result of war veterans returning home and their sharing of experiences and suffering. Many more pathways and policies continue to be enacted to protect those who battle mental health conditions and PTSD. However, oftentimes, minorities and non-warfare PTSD survivors are left out of the conversation and out of policies. With the changing attitudes within hegemonic masculinity, it is probable that more survivals will rid their shame of coming forward. It is hopeful that survivors, war veterans, and civilians alike will seek adequate resources and benefit from the web of support so that all can lead sustaining and fulfilling lives.